The rain had a different sound in that part of the world, not the thin, polite drizzle of American winters, but a kind that breathed, heavy and patient, like an old lung refusing to give up. It fell over the high borderlands between Vietnam and Laos, over soil red as dried blood, over bamboo that still whispered names long buried beneath. On the third morning of the excavation, the rain came sideways, drawn by wind from the river gorge. A local worker lifted his shovel, blinked through the downpour, and hit something that didn't ring like stone. The metallic clank cut through the air, and even the rain seemed to pause for half a breath. He looked down. A curve of rusted metal pushed back at the mud. Another man shouted. More hands gathered. They dug, slow at first, then faster, until a shape took form, round, industrial, sealed, an old American oil drum. When they pried the lid open, a smell rose that no one wanted to name, a blend of soil and time and something that had once been human. Inside lay fragments of uniforms, bones, a boot still laced, a dog tag blackened by decades of rot. One of the Vietnamese men took a step back and crossed himself. The American team leader whispered into the rain, "Jesus, these are ours." They opened the second drum, then a third. By noon, there were 11 in total, lined up like silent coffins beneath the tarp. Inside each, pieces of the same story, U.S. military gear, rusted rifles, skeletons curled against each other as if still hiding from the monsoon, and one thing more. In the 11th drum, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, they found a small bundle, a square of faded green canvas bound by tape. When the specialists unwrapped it that night under sterile light, they discovered a single piece of paper, crumbling, water-eaten, the ink almost vanished. Through magnifiers, faint letters emerged, shaky, desperate, but still legible enough to wound. "If we die, the one who killed us is the commander." 2 weeks later, halfway across the world, an old man watched the footage on a cracked laptop in a quiet motel room outside Chicago. His name was Daniel Mercer, a retired war correspondent, 65, his hands stiff from old injuries and typewriter years. He replayed the clip again and again, the mud, the drums, the line of white helmets in the rain. He didn't flinch when the camera panned over the bones. But when the paper appeared, his breath caught. He had heard those words before, decades ago, through a radio half buried in the dirt of another battlefield. Back then he hadn't believed them. Back then he had believed in someone else. On the screen, a caption read, "Remains confirmed. Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Division. Listed missing, 1970. Daniel whispered it aloud. "Bravo Company." And under his breath, almost a prayer, "Hill 47. He closed the laptop and sat back in the half-dark. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake like a memory returning. Somewhere in a locked box beneath his bed lay a cassette tape marked in fading ink. Hill 47. Night 2. He hadn't played it in 40 years. 2 flights and 1 sleepless layover later, Daniel found himself back in Southeast Asia. The world had changed its shape, but not its smell. Diesel and humidity, old rice, the tang of rust. He hired a driver from Da Nang who spoke just enough English to say, "American bones?" Daniel nodded. The man said nothing more the entire trip. By the time they reached the dig site, rain had stopped, but the air still carried the weight of it. The excavation tents stood pale against the dark soil, each one humming with generators and the low voices of translators. Scientists. Soldiers. Daniel stood at the edge of the pit. He could feel the ground soften beneath his shoes, as if the earth itself was trying to remember what it had swallowed. A forensic technician lifted a fragment of cloth with tweezers. On it, barely visible, was the faded outline of a U.S. flag. Someone murmured, 50 years under clay and it still bleeds color. Daniel crouched, touched the mud with his gloved hand. It was warm, almost alive. 12 confirmed so far, a young officer said beside him, but 1 dog tag's missing. Maybe swept downstream back then. Daniel looked up. 12? The officer nodded. Bravo Company had 13 men listed on the roster, 12 drums, 12 sets of remains. Maybe the 13th never made it out here. Daniel's throat tightened. He knew that number by heart. 13, and one of them had carried a radio call sign Echo 27. That voice had once saved his own life. Night settled over the camp with the slow patience of the tropics. Cicadas rose like static. Daniel sat alone by the floodlights, writing notes that felt less like journalism and more like confession. He remembered the name of their captain, Raymond Harlan. Back then, just captain. Now a decorated general, silver-haired, celebrated, giving lectures about honor under fire. He opened a folder of printouts, old newspaper clippings, congressional photos, smiling medals. Each headline felt like another lie carved in stone. He whispered to the air, "If they're right, if he really killed them, then I was saved by a murderer." The thought stayed with him long after the lights were turned off. At dawn, he climbed the slope behind the site. From there he could see the river bend, a gray ribbon cutting through jungle mist. Somewhere beyond those trees lay Hill 47, flattened now by time and erosion. The locals called it Joy Calm, the Silent Hill. An old fisherman stood by the waterline repairing a net. Daniel asked through a translator if the man remembered any fighting there. The fisherman smiled, toothless, shook his head. "Kong no," he said. "I don't remember." But his hands never stopped moving, tying knots again and again, as if memory was something he was trying to bind shut. That night Daniel returned to his small guest-house room. He placed the cassette on the table. For a long time he stared at it. The old plastic warped, label faded. Then slowly he pressed play. Static first, then wind. Then a man's voice, faint, trembling, cutting through distance. "Echo 27, this is Bravo Company. We're not where we're supposed to be. Command's gone. The captain says stay put till sunrise." Then another voice, sharper, angry, too clear for the static to hide. "He's lying. He's not calling command. He's calling them. He's—" The tape cut into noise. Daniel sat back. The aircon hummed like a low heartbeat. He whispered, "Owen, you were right, weren't you?" The rain returned on his last night in the valley. It came with no warning, just a shift in the wind, the smell of tin and moss, and then a wall of water that erased the sound of generators. Daniel watched from the doorway of the tent as the excavation team covered the drums again. The same technician who'd found the note carried a lantern across the mud. Its light moved like a small sun trapped in storm water. He recorded one final line in his notebook. "The earth remembers what men choose to forget." Then he closed it. He had enough. Enough to begin, at least. The flight to Seattle felt longer than the war itself. Somewhere over the Pacific, Daniel dreamed in colors he'd thought he'd forgotten. Orange tracer rounds, blue smoke, the silver of a watch on a dead man's wrist. When he woke, coffee trembled in his cup. A flight attendant asked if he was returning home or leaving it. He didn't answer. Back in the States, the world looked too clean. Airports, advertisements, faces unscarred by humidity or guilt. He checked into a cheap hotel on the edge of Portland, spread his notes across the bed, and turned on the news. The name General Raymond Harlan filled the screen. A reporter smiled. A living legend. The man who led troops through impossible odds at Hill 47, soon to receive the Medal of Freedom. Daniel stared at the image. Harlan, at 82, shoulders still square, eyes bright with that practiced humility only men of power can perfect. He turned the volume down until the voice became a hum and spoke to the silent room. He still knows how to stand in the light. He spent days calling old contacts, archivists, veterans, field medics. Most didn't pick up. Those who did spoke softly, always looking for a way out of the conversation. "Let it go, Dan. That war's buried. Don't dig up ghosts that kept us alive." But on the fourth night, a message blinked on his phone, a single line from an old quartermaster he hadn't seen since '70. "Check the family of Owen Keller." The next morning Daniel drove south through rain that felt like déjà vu. The GPS led him to a small town tucked between pine ridges, Oregon country, quiet and green. He parked in front of a weathered farmhouse where lavender grew along the fence. The scent drifted through the air, soft, fragile, clean. He knocked. A woman opened the door, white hair pulled back, face thin but steady. Her eyes searched him for the story he might be bringing. "I'm looking for Mrs. Margaret Keller," he said. "You found her." He introduced himself, showed his press card, mentioned the excavation. For a moment she didn't move. Then she stepped aside and said, almost politely, "Come in before the rain starts again." Inside, the house smelled of old wood and tea. Photographs lined the mantel, a boy in uniform, a wedding in black and white, a young man with a radio slung over one shoulder. Dust lay like memory on everything. Daniel sat. She poured tea without asking how he took it. "I'm writing about Bravo Company," he began. "I think you knew someone in it." Her hands paused only for a second. Then she set the teapot down carefully and said, "I did. My husband, Private Owen Keller." He nodded. "I believe he might have." She interrupted quietly. "He's dead. He killed them all and ran. At least that's what they told me." Her voice didn't tremble, but her eyes were dry in a way that only years of believing can make them. Daniel asked, "Who told you that?" She looked at the window, where rain had begun to fall again. "Captain Harlan. He came after the war. Said Owen went mad, turned on his men. He showed me a letter, a confession. He said it was found near the site." Daniel leaned forward. "Do you still have that letter?" She rose without a word, crossed to a drawer, and returned with an envelope sealed in plastic. Inside, a single sheet of yellowed paper. At the bottom, a shaky signature. Owen Keller. Daniel studied it. The ink bled at the edges, the handwriting uncertain, uneven, wrong. He had seen Owen's neat block letters on field reports. This wasn't him. He asked, "Do you know anyone who could have forged this?" Margaret smiled sadly. "Anyone who can forge a war can forge a name." He stayed another hour, listening. She spoke little. Mostly she watched the window. When he asked why she'd kept the letter if she doubted it, she said, "Because keeping it was easier than hoping." Before leaving, he asked one last thing. "Mrs. Keller, do you still believe he's dead?" Her answer came after a long silence. "I believe the man I loved was killed, maybe not by bullets." That night Daniel rented a small cabin nearby. He couldn't sleep. The rain kept changing rhythm like a heartbeat that refused to settle. He laid out the letter beside his notebook. Two truths stared at him: the handwriting that lied and the woman who'd lived inside that lie. He opened his laptop and searched the archives again. The Bravo Company roster appeared on screen. 13 names, one radio operator listed MIA, presumed dead. He read it again and whispered, "Owen Keller. Radio call, sign Echo 27. The same call sign he'd heard on that cassette 40 years ago. Morning. A pale sun filtered through mist. Daniel drove to a nearby Veterans Hall, one of those places that smelled of coffee and dust and metals no one polished anymore. He met an old sergeant named Reddick, skin like bark, voice like gravel. When Daniel mentioned Bravo Company, the man's hand tightened on his cup. "I remember them," Reddick said. "They went off-grid near the Laotian border. Harlan led them out, said the jungle swallowed the rest. But there were rumors. They said Bravo found something, gold shipments, black market cargo. Then they disappeared." Daniel asked, "You ever meet Keller?" "Once. Kid with a radio, quiet, smart, wrote everything down. If he ran, he had a reason." Reddick pulled a crumpled napkin toward him, drew 13 small marks. "Official story says 12 dead, but I saw the manifest. 13 on that patrol, he circled the last mark. The 13th never came home, never buried." He looked up. "Find that one, Mercer. He's the only voice left." That night, Daniel returned to his cabin and opened the cassette case again. He rewound the tape to the end, past the static, past the screams. For a few seconds, silence, then a whisper, "If anyone hears this, tell Margaret I didn't." The tape stopped there. Daniel sat motionless. Outside, the rain finally ceased. In the pause that followed, the world felt too quiet, as if listening. By morning, the rain had rinsed the town to a raw brightness. Daniel folded the letter back into its plastic sleeve and slipped it into his bag like a fragile bone. There are days when a story pushes you from behind, he thought, and days when it waits ahead like a door you are not yet brave enough to open. This was both. He drove north beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. Phone calls blurred into highway miles. He spoke to 2 archivists, a clerk who owed him a favor, a medic who pretended not to remember. At a state records office that still smelled faintly of carbon paper, a woman with a careful voice said, "If you are asking whether a man named Owen Keller filed anything after 1971, the answer is no." Then, after a breath, "But a Joseph Carter did. Same date of birth. No Social Security until late. Hands injured. Filed as agricultural accident." Her voice softened into curiosity. Why would anyone start a life at 45? Daniel thanked her and hung up. He felt the cassette in his jacket pocket like a small animal. Joseph Carter. Not an uncommon name, but uncommon enough when it carries a past that never learned to die. He followed the thread into the country of cold. Montana in March, long fields of frost, fences scribbling across the land, mountains that kept their own counsel. A small town where every business had its window taped against winter, and every bar stool knew the weight of old men. He found a room above a bakery that rose warm at dawn and returned to silence after noon. On the first morning he stood at the window with coffee and watched a single truck drive down Main Street like a sentence no one wanted to finish. At the post office, a clerk, with cheeks as red as apples, asked for a name. "Carter," Daniel said. "Joseph. Lives out by the lake?" She smiled. Small-town smiles always start with suspicion and end in kindness. "Joe gets packages of wires and vacuum tubes, fixes radios for the old boys, lives in the cabin that used to belong to the Hardys. Don't go at night. The road turns to ice when it remembers how." "Does he talk much?" She shook her head. "He listens." That's different. The road out to the lake was a lesson in restraint. Pines carried last week's snow like old regrets. A hawk drew a long seam through the air. He reached the water, a sheet of slate with wind skating across it, and there, across a narrow inlet, stood a cabin made from boards the color of tobacco. No smoke, no car, only a clothesline with 3 wooden pegs and a blue towel hardened by weather. He walked the last 100 yards. He didn't knock. Not yet. He circled the place like a cautious thought. On the workbench beneath the window lay a row of radios, some hollowed to their ribs, some open like mouths, waiting for a word. The simplest among them had a cracked dial with stations printed in a faded ring. Saigon among them, a ghost frequency from another life. He pressed a palm to the window frame. Inside, he could see the shape of a chair polished by the body that favored it. Next to it, a shelf with a few books, a fishing guide, a Bible whose spine held more air than paper, and a U.S. Army field manual with its cover peeled white. Daniel stepped back and left a note pinned to the door with a finishing nail he found on the sill. "Joe, I'm not here to harm you. I have come because 12 men were found and 1 voice is still missing. -D. M." He walked away, letting the lake hold the rest of his words. In town, he waited. He learned the shape of the afternoon by the sound of the school bus, the tilt of the winter sun, the way the bakery closed exactly when the shadows reached the chalkboard menu. He ate soup that tasted like patience and bread that told him nothing at all. He asked a ranger at the gas station if he knew a man who kept to himself by the water. "Guy with a limp," the ranger said without looking up, "carries a small tin in his pocket. Every time he hears thunder, he touches it, like counting a debt." "What kind of tin?" "Silver. Old." The ranger finally looked at him. "Why?" Daniel only shrugged. "Some details you keep close until they show you what they're for." On the 3rd evening the temperature fell as if someone had opened a door to a larger winter. He drove back to the lake and found smoke, a thin rope of it. The cabin's window glowed the color of memory. He walked to the porch, stood in the quiet between his breath and the door. The note was gone. In its place the finishing nail had been pushed back into the wood, flush, precise, as if to say, "I understand tools." and messages. He knocked once. The floor creaked inside. The door opened, not wide, not narrow, just enough to let him see a man whose face had learned the art of edges, hair white at the temples, skin creased deeply at the eyes, a small tremor in the left hand that held the frame. The man studied him the way a mechanic studies a sound before deciding where to listen. "Joe," Daniel said softly. Silence. Then the man spoke, his voice like gravel sifted through cloth. "Who sent you?" "I sent myself," Daniel replied. "But the dead helped?" A flicker in the man's eyes. "Which dead?" 12 of them, found in drums the color of regret. Another silence. Longer. "Come in," the man said. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and solder. On the table lay that small tin the ranger had mentioned. Worn, oval, once shiny, now a country of scratches and dull light. Daniel didn't stare at it, but the man noticed anyway and placed a thumb over the lid. "You brought the rain," the man said, though the weather had been clean for hours. "No," Daniel answered, easing into the chair he'd already imagined from the window. "The rain brought me." They sat. The stove ticked softly. Somewhere in the cabin a radio whispered to itself, just enough to make the air feel less alone. Daniel laid the plastic sleeve on the table. Inside, the letter signed, Owen Keller looked back like a face stamped into ice. For a moment the man didn't touch it. Then he did, one finger tracing the edge, as if it were dangerous. "Captain Harlan gave that to my wife," he said, not asking a question. Daniel nodded. "He told her you killed them and ran." The man smiled without humor. "I did run. That part of the lie is true." "Joe," Daniel said carefully, "if that's your name—" "It isn't," the man answered, but it kept the wolves confused. He lifted the tin and turned it in his hands. "It's easier to move through a country when you've already buried your shadow." The stove popped once, sharp as a knuckle. Outside, the lake shifted under a sudden wind. "Why are you here?" the man asked at last. "Because they found the drums," Daniel said. "Because I heard your voice on a tape I shouldn't have kept. Because the truth can still breathe if we don't seal it too tight." The man's left hand trembled. He cupped it with his right until the tremor looked like prayer. "My voice," he said, as if tasting the idea. "It wasn't brave," Daniel told him. "It was only alive." The man opened the tin. Inside lay 3 objects. A dog tag blackened by time, a strip of green cloth cut from a jacket, and a photograph the size of a palm, sun-faded, edges chewed by years. The photograph showed a woman in a simple dress, hair pinned back, the ghost of a smile that had learned to keep its own counsel. He set the tin down gently. "Her name is Margaret," the man said. Daniel nodded, resisting the urge to say is instead of was. "She's the one who kept you alive," Daniel said. "No," the man answered. "The lie kept me alive. She kept me human. They let that live between them a while." At last Daniel said, "I need to ask you something that will hurt." The man smiled a tired kindness. "Most questions that matter do. Did Harlan steal gold?" "Yes." "Did he murder your squad?" The man looked at the stove as if it were a small theater. "He murdered their names first," he said. "The rest was logistics." Daniel breathed, in and out, the way a diver does when the surface is close enough to guess at but not yet to touch. "Will you tell it?" he asked. "All of it. On record." The man closed the tin, placed it back where it belonged, and rested his hands flat on the table as if bracing against a wave. "Not to you," he said. The word struck like a cold. "Then to who?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice from pleading. The man looked at the photograph again, and when he spoke, his voice gentled in a way that felt like remembering how to walk. "To her," he said, "if she'll listen." The stove ticked. The lake took back the wind it had borrowed. Daniel inclined his head. "I can take you to her," he said. "I know," the man replied. "That's why you came." He rose, moved to a shelf, and picked up a small radio with a cracked dial, one of the rescued relics. He switched it on, static, then a long thin line of nothing, then a breath of an old frequency like a throat clearing after half a century. He held it out. "You first," he said. "You speak for the dead." "I'll speak for the one who ran." Daniel took the radio. His hands knew how to hold it. He looked at the door, at the night beyond, at the road that would freeze by morning and then thaw and then become what roads always become, a line between two lives. "Tomorrow," he said. The man nodded. "Tomorrow," he echoed, and for the first time his voice carried something that might, in another age, have been hope. Daniel stepped to the threshold. The wind was colder, the stars very clear, the lake a quiet plate of iron. Behind him, the cabin exhaled a thin ribbon of smoke that rose and thinned and did not ask to be noticed. He paused with his hand on the latch, and the man, who had once been Owen Keller, said one last thing. Not a question, not a plea, just the smallest proof that a heart can remember its old shape. "Tell me," he said, "what color the rain was, where they found them." "Red," Daniel answered. "Red that had learned to wait." He closed the door gently. The night took him in. Morning came blue and clean, as if the lake had ironed the sky during the night. Frost drew pale flowers on the cabin window. The stove had gone quiet, and the air held the thin cold that makes every sentence short. Daniel warmed his hands on a mug and watched the man who had once been Owen Keller slide a small pack across the table, radio wrapped in cloth, the oval tin, a sweater worn to threads at the cuffs. "You travel light," Daniel said. "I learned what a man can carry and still run," the man answered. He touched the tin with 2 fingers, then took them away as if the metal remembered pain. "Where is she?" "Oregon," Daniel said. "A day's drive if we don't ask the road too many questions." The man nodded. He stood, and for a moment the tremor in his left hand looked like a moth trying to lift from a window. Then he closed that hand inside the other, and the moth became still. They locked the cabin. Wind picked up from the water and walked through the pines. On the porch he paused, as if listening for a frequency the weather kept to itself, then turned toward the truck. Halfway to town they passed an old billboard whose paint had peeled into an accidental map. Daniel thought, places forget faster than people. Wood sheds its names. Bone does not. He kept the thought to himself. Some truths are only useful when they stay quiet. At the cafe on Main they ate eggs that tasted like the morning was trying and toast that knew its job. No one stared. In towns like this, not staring is a kind of courtesy, a way to leave a man inside his own weather. On the highway, miles began to fold. The man sat with his shoulders a little too straight, like someone who'd learned posture from carrying weight that didn't want to be lifted. After an hour he spoke. "Did she keep the letter?" he asked. "She did," Daniel said. "In a drawer, in plastic. She handled it like it could still stain her." He watched the man's jaw work once, twice, as if swallowing an old nail. "I sign my name clean," he said. "Block letters. In basic, they taught us, if the bullet doesn't kill you, confusion will. That letter," he stopped. "That letter is confusion." "She kept it," Daniel said, "because keeping it was easier than hoping." The man turned his head slightly, the trace of a nod. "Hope is heavy," he murmured. "It rusts if you leave it in the rain." They drove. The mountains lifted, settled, lifted again. Clouds moved with the formal grace of ships. When they stopped for gas outside Spokane, a boy wiping windshields offered to check the oil. The man said, "No," too quickly, then softened it with, "Thanks." His left hand hovered near his pocket, where the tin made a small square against the denim. Back on the road, Daniel opened the tape recorder he'd carried since a younger war and placed it on the console between them. "I want to be clear," he said. "You decide what breathes. I decide how it's spelled. If either of us makes a mistake, the dead pay. Agreed?" The man glanced at the machine as if it might bite. "Agreed," he said, "but not her name. If I say her name, it's because I want it heard." "Margaret," Daniel said, the way a man sets a lantern where it should have always been. The man did not correct him. They crossed the Columbia, the river running pewter under a sky that could not decide whether to be kind. In the distance, fields lay shaved to stubble. Rows of trees stood like sentences not yet diagrammed. The man spoke in pieces, like someone testing a bridge of words before trusting it with weight. "We were 13, he said. "Everyone says 12, but I can feel 13 when I count it in my bones. I carried the radio. It was warm against my back. Machines that speak are warmer than machines that kill." Daniel let the engine noise do the nodding for him. The man continued. "Harlan said the map changed. He said command wanted us off the ridge, into the draw. He said a lot of things men say when they need you to move. At dusk we found the drums. No markings that told the truth, only numbers painted by someone who didn't expect to be read." "Gold?" Daniel asked. "And other things that buy silence," the man said. "But the gold shone even in jungle light. It does that. It knows how to be seen." "Who else saw it?" "Everyone who died," he said, "and me, which is a kind of dying." They passed a sign for a town whose name was too proud for its size. Traffic thickened, then thinned. A flock of geese stitched itself across the sky. "Did anyone speak up?" Daniel asked. "Two men," he said. "Campbell and Ortiz." Campbell laughed when he said it. Some men laugh when they are brave, to borrow air from the joke. Ortiz didn't laugh. He just said we'd need a pencil. Then he died first. And Campbell laughed again, without the sound. "How?" Daniel's voice had gone low, the way it always did when he was compiling harm. "Accident that wasn't," the man said. "Harlan never dirtied his hands with dirt. He made the places do it for him. Place a man where a bullet wants to be. Place a story where a witness cannot stand. By night he had us in the draw. Rain came as ordered. He told us to dig in. We did. Shallow graves we were instructed to call foxholes. He quieted then, as if a switch had clicked inside. Daniel let the silence sit beside them. They entered Oregon under a sky that seemed to understand the conversation and hold back weather out of respect. Near Pendleton the man slept for 20 minutes, his mouth a thin line, one hand still on the tin. When he woke, he looked at the window as if expecting to find jungle there. "Almost home," Daniel said. "Home is a word that dies if you feed it years," the man answered. But he softened his tone with, "Thank you for driving." By late afternoon they turned off the interstate and let two-lane roads slow their hearts. Lavender fields appeared, the winter kind, low and gray-green, waiting for a season that still believed in return. Daniel felt the world narrow to coordinates he had already visited. An old fence, a mailbox with paint flaking toward anonymity, a porch whose boards knew a certain weight. He stopped the truck half a block away. The man did not move. "Do you want me to go first?" Daniel asked. "No," he said. "If I've waited this long, I should be the first to be seen." They walked the last distance. The air carried wood smoke and the careful smell of someone who had learned how to make ordinary things clean. On the porch, a wind chime made from broken spoons ticked gently. The sound of thrift turned to music. Daniel stepped back. The man lifted his hand to knock, then lowered it. He looked at Daniel as if seeking permission from a witness. Daniel gave a single nod. He knocked. The door opened to the chain, then closed, then opened again without it. Margaret Keller stood looking at a face that had been rebuilt by time. Her hands went to her mouth, an old gesture from when people still believed hands could hold in a sound. The first sentence she chose was not a question. "You're dead," she said. "Not properly," the man answered. His voice shook, then found a rail. "I am sorry for every day that used that idea to breathe." She stared. The world inside the house remained perfectly still, as if furniture had taken an oath not to interfere. She stepped aside. He entered. Daniel remained on the porch long enough to understand that the moment belonged to two people and the weather. Then he went down the steps and sat on the top stair, where he could hear without stealing. At first there was no sound. Then chairs moved. Wood, speaking briefly to wood. Then the small domestic noises of tea, water, cups, the polite arithmetic of ordinary kindness. Finally, her voice, the one he'd heard in a room the color of late rain. "Captain Harlan told me you killed them," she said. "He brought a letter. He told me to keep the truth in a drawer." "I brought a different kind of letter," the man said. "It doesn't look like paper." "What does it look like?" "Like a tin. And a name that won't die right." Something loosened in the house. Not forgiveness. Wind doesn't forgive the tree it bends. But recognition, perhaps. Two mirrors choosing not to argue with the face. Daniel stared at the street. A boy rode past on a bicycle with a baseball card pegged to the spokes, making the old heroic noise of machines. His father called from a doorway, and the boy turned toward it as if gravity had a voice. Behind him, the man began to speak. He spoke in the slow, exact way of someone dismantling a bomb he'd built himself. He named the place. He named the rain. He named the men by order of falling, which is a kind of prayer. Margaret did not interrupt. Once the kettle clicked, as if agreeing to boil again. Once a bird hit the window lightly and reconsidered the idea of glass. When he reached the part about the drums, 11 lined like iron mouths, one left too near water, his breath shivered. He steadied it with both hands on the table, palms flat, as if telling the wood, "Don't let me leave my body, yet." "Why did you run?" she asked at last. "Because I wasn't dead," he said. And because he was. He didn't say Harlan's name. Some names the air should not have to carry twice. A long pause followed, the kind that builds a bridge between past and what refuses to be future. Then Margaret said very softly, "I kept the letter because hoping was heavy." "I kept the tin because forgetting was heavier," he answered. Daniel closed his eyes. A truck passed, and the wind lifted the spoon chime into small, bright arithmetic. He felt the weight of the cassette in his pocket and did not reach for it. Some machines know when to be silent. Inside she spoke again, one sentence that folded suspicion and hurt into something that could be held without bleeding. "Stay," she said, "for tea." The man exhaled. A chair moved, the sound of an old life trying its first step. Daniel opened his eyes to the gray light and let the world decide the next weather. Steam rose from the cups, like ghosts rehearsing how to leave. Daniel watched from the porch rail. Through the window he could see the three of them, 2 souls and the space between, outlined by the small lamp. Inside, words moved slowly, like fish in shallow water. He did not write. He only listened to the hush that follows recognition. The rain had gone, but left its smell, that sweet ache of wet wood and metal beginning again to rust. "Stay for tea," she'd said, and maybe for forgiveness, he thought, though he knew that wasn't the same thing. Margaret. Her hand shook, pouring water. Half a century of silence had taught them steadiness, but not this kind. She looked at him across the table, the same shoulders, thinner now, the same eyes that once searched the jungle for a signal. She wanted to ask 100 questions and none at all. He was dead, she reminded herself. The world said so. The medal said so. The man who buried him kissed my hand and told me the government was proud. But here he sat, breathing like a small apology. Out loud she said, "You look older." He smiled, not kindly, not sadly, just honestly. "I earned it," he said. Daniel. He could hear them from where he sat. He told himself he'd come for truth, but he stayed because truth sounds different when people whisper it to each other instead of into a microphone. He thought of the drums in the rain, the line of bones, the single empty space that had made this moment possible. Inside, cups touched saucers. He heard the woman say something soft. He couldn't catch it. And then the man's answer, a low chord under her voice. The sound had the weight of confession, the rhythm of memory rubbing against mercy. When he finally stepped back inside, the air felt warmer. The kettle had stopped hissing. Margaret sat with her hands folded on the table, palms open as if waiting to receive a verdict. Owen, because there was no reason to call him Joseph anymore, looked at Daniel with that same controlled tremor. "Tell him," she said to her husband. Owen nodded once. He began quietly, a man measuring each word before releasing it. "We found the drums 2 days before the storm. Harlan said they were enemy supply caches, but the markings were ours, American shipping codes, not Vietnamese. Gold bars wrapped in tarps, opium bricks, crates of watches. He said they were to be recovered for intelligence. Campbell made a joke about early retirement. Nobody laughed twice." Daniel turned on the recorder. The red light blinked small and merciless. Owen didn't seem to see it. That night, he continued, Harlan sent the radio team, me and Ortiz, to find a clearer channel. We climbed the ridge. When I called command, no one answered. Then I heard him behind me. He said, "Shut it off." Ortiz tried to speak. The flash lit his face for half a second. Then there was just rain and the smell. He stopped. Margaret's fingers pressed together until the knuckles whitened. Daniel waited. The tape rolled its small private storm. After that, Owen said, it was simple. He told the others the ridge was compromised, that we were to move lower. The rain came harder. He ordered us to dig in. I remember thinking, the ground is too soft, it won't hold. I was right. It held us instead. His eyes unfocused, as if he were watching the jungle replay on the far wall. He threw the first grenade himself. The rest came from his men, those still believing orders were oxygen. I don't know how I crawled out. I don't know why he let me. Maybe he thought the hill would finish what he started. Silence filled the kitchen until it had its own pulse. Margaret rose, turned away, pressed her hand against the sink. Her shoulders shook once, quietly, like a shutter closing. Daniel reached out to switch off the recorder, but she said, "Leave it on." Her voice was steady again, built from the same steel as the years that had kept her alive. She faced them both. "You said he threw the first grenade." "Yes." "You saw him?" "I heard the pin. I saw his face in the light before it went dark. You don't forget the direction of a man's eyes when he pulls the pin." Margaret nodded slowly. "I believe you," she said. "I think part of me always did." Later, when Owen stepped outside for air, Daniel stayed behind. Margaret poured more tea, though no one wanted it. "You think anyone will care?" she asked. Daniel said, "Care is the wrong word. They'll react. Then they'll file it under history and call it closure." She smiled, a thin, tired crescent. "Closure's just another name for burial." He didn't argue. Through the window they saw Owen by the fence, touching the top rail like a man testing the edge of forgiveness. Margaret whispered, "He's still waiting for the next order." Daniel said, "Maybe this time it's his." That night Daniel slept on the couch. Dreams came like bad film. Cuts too sharp, light too white. He woke to find Owen already sitting by the window, staring into the kind of dawn that doesn't change color for hours. "I thought it would help," Owen said. "Telling it. Didn't it? It made it true again?" He turned from the window, eyes hollow but dry. "I kept the gold once," he said. "Not to spend. Just a single coin to prove it existed. I buried it under the cabin. Sometimes I think the earth hums differently." There Daniel asked, "Do you still have it?" Owen shook his head. "The rain took it." "Maybe that's justice." Margaret came in then, wrapped in a shawl that smelled of lavender and firewood. She looked at the two men, the journalist holding questions like glass, the soldier holding silence like stone. She said, "You're both ghosts, trying to decide who gets the body." Owen smiled faintly. "She's right," he said. Daniel replied, "Ghosts don't drive trucks." "Maybe," Owen said, "but they give directions." By afternoon, Daniel sent copies of the tape to 3 places, 2 that would pretend not to receive it and 1 that might. He typed notes until the ribbon smeared the letters into a bruise. Outside, Margaret tended the small lavender plot, her movements slow, deliberate, like someone tracing forgiveness into soil. Owen sat nearby, sanding the handle of an old radio antenna. He spoke without looking up. "Do you think he knows yet?" "Harlan." "Wherever he is," Daniel said, "men like him build rooms that don't have mirrors. Sometimes dying is the only way they see themselves." The man nodded, the gesture both prayer and fatigue. He glanced toward Margaret. "She deserves to live in a world that doesn't rhyme with mine." "She already does," Daniel said. "She just let you visit." The man smiled, the first true one Daniel had seen. "Then I should leave before I break the furniture." Evening came slow, the light coppered by dust. Daniel packed the recorder, his notebook, the plastic sleeve containing the false letter. He looked once more at the couple framed in the doorway, the way she touched his shoulder when she spoke, the way he tilted his head slightly as if to translate tenderness back into his own language. He thought, the story isn't over, but maybe it's finally started to breathe. As he drove away, the spoon chimes sang behind him, soft, uneven, like Morse code from another century. The next day broke thin and gray, the sky undecided about whether to risk light. Daniel drove into town to fax transcripts. Old equipment, new weather. Owen stayed behind to repair a radio that had once spoken better Vietnamese than he did. Margaret cleared a drawer she hadn't opened in 10 years. In the copy shop, the machine stuttered like a nervous witness. Pages slid out warm with words that had taken 50 years to find ink. On the wall, a television murmured a morning show's cheerful lies, then cut to breaking news. General Raymond Harlan, leaving a marble building flanked by men whose suits fit like alibis. A reporter smiled with teeth that had never bitten through a combat ration. General Harlan will deliver the keynote at the Veterans Legacy Gala this weekend. Sources say the administration is considering him for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The volume was low, but the room heard it anyway. A man at the counter said, "About time." The clerk nodded, like a citizen practicing gratitude. Daniel stared at the screen until the smile blurred. At the farmhouse, Margaret pulled the bottom drawer all the way out and set it on the floor. Behind it, where dust had settled like a quiet verdict, a small wooden box waited. She did not remember hiding it there. She remembered only being told to put away anything that hurt to look at. The box was military issue once, olive paint gone to winter. She opened it and found the archive of a life paused, a marriage certificate, a ribbon in a color she couldn't name, a single cufflink, 3 letters in an unfamiliar hand signed Reddick, a Polaroid fogged at the edges, and at the bottom, wrapped in oil paper, a film can the size of a saucer. Her hands were steady now. On the metal lid, etched by something sharp and impatient, a line of letters. Hill 47, supply drop, beneath it, a date, 1970, and beneath that, a short initial scratched so hard it had broken the paint, M. She did not know which M she was. Margaret, then. Margaret, now. She closed the box and waited for the sound of tires in gravel. Daniel was halfway home when his phone rang. Unknown number, East Coast prefix, the kind that assumes it will be answered. He put it on speaker. A careful male voice introduced himself as counsel for a Veterans Foundation. "Mr. Mercer, we've been informed you are circulating unfounded allegations concerning General Harlan. We strongly advise you to refrain. There are statutes, defamation, interference with charitable activities. Men of honor deserve protection from the restless." Daniel smiled without mirth. "Men of honor don't need protection from the past." A pause, paper shuffling, or conscience. "Consider this a courtesy call," the voice said, softening to threat. "Next time it's a letter." The line went dead. He drove faster. Owen was on the porch when he arrived, the radio in his lap whispering to itself. He looked up without surprise. "Phone?" he asked. "Teeth," Daniel said. Owen nodded. "They bite less when you show them bones." "Do we have bones?" "Not enough for a dog," Owen said, "but maybe enough to make it curious." Margaret stepped onto the porch then, the wooden box in her arms. She placed it on the table as if setting down a sleeping animal that might wake and claim the room. "I found this," she said. They looked at the lid, at the words that had waited half a century for air. Owen inhaled, like a man who'd forgotten that lungs can choose to move. He didn't touch the canister. Margaret did. Her thumb found the gouged initial, traced it, then pulled back as if it were hot. "Where did you get it?" Daniel asked. "Harlan," she said after a breath that cost her. "He brought it when he brought the letter. He said it came from the site. He told me to keep it safe, like a relic. I did not open it. She swallowed. "I thought it might prove Owen's guilt if anyone ever asked. I thought proof would make the neighbors quieter." Owen's face didn't move, but something in the room did. Not forgiveness. The window couldn't bear that much weight. But a hinge loosened somewhere, a door inside an old house finally admitting air. Daniel lifted the can. Cold metal, heavier than it looked. He turned it. The seal remained intact. "Do we have a projector?" Owen answered, "I have what survives." He disappeared into the back and returned with a battered 16mm projector in a canvas case that had earned its dust. He set it on the table, a machine with the gravity of memory. It smelled faintly of school auditoriums and lost summers. They threaded the film with fingers that performed a sacred procedure without instruction. Margaret drew the curtains. Afternoon dimmed to a wash of brown. The projector breathed, stuttered, then found its old rhythm. Light struck the wall. At first, trees, jittering, a sky cupped by leaves, the stamping feet of men half amused to be filmed. A hand entered the frame and waggled 2 fingers in an old American peace sign that now looked like a premonition. Then the image shook. The perspective dropped. Someone had lowered the camera to chest height to hide its seeing. Across the frame, drums, American, numbers scabbed in white, a pry bar, a gloved hand, the lid levered up. Light flashed against stackable gold wrapped in wax cloth. Even in black and white, gold knows how to be gold. The frame jumped. A face blurred past. Campbell, maybe, or a man who shared his laughter. Then the lens found Harlan, young, square, the jaw that speeches are made for. He looked directly at the camera for half a heartbeat. Then away. The practiced glance of a man who always knows where the angles are. He gestured. Men moved. One drum toppled, another was rolled toward a shallow pit. In the near ground the camera caught a bootlace in mud. Then, suddenly, Ortiz, smiling small at something off-screen. Then his eyes flinched. Light flared. The frame went white, and when it returned, the camera was side-on, tilted, breathing fast. The last seconds were a geometry of hands and rain. Harlan again, closer, his mouth a line sharp enough to cut. He reached for something off-frame. The image tore, burned a bright hole, and the reel ran out with the soft clap of a thin metal tongue. No one spoke until the projector forgot its purpose and fell still. Margaret said very softly, "I brought this into my house. I set it next to the bed where I kept my sleep. I didn't look. I thought not looking was loyalty." Owen's voice came thin. "You kept me alive," he said. "Even if you didn't know which me." She faced him. "Do you want me to be sorry for the wrong things now, or the right ones later?" He almost smiled. "Later. It'll last longer." Daniel rewound the film by hand, feeling the tension, the delicate anger of spooled truth. "We need a clean transfer," he said, "and custody. If we send it to the wrong lab, it disappears and reappears as rumor." "Can you do it?" Margaret asked. "I know a place that still believes machines are honest," Daniel said. 2 hours away. They packed the projector, the can, the recorder, the letter that was a lie. Before they left, Margaret went to her bedroom and returned with a small velvet box. Inside lay a wedding ring more scratched than gold. "I wore it even when the town wanted me to take it off," she said. She slid it back on. Her hand looked heavier and at peace with the weight. They drove in silence until the road decided to speak. A pothole, a bridge, the long breath of a valley. Owen watched the shoulders, as if ambush was a habit that didn't retire. Margaret counted mile markers as if they were rosary beads made of distance. Halfway there, Daniel's phone chimed. An email from a network contact. 3 sentences that could curdle or bless a day. "We reviewed your initial audio. It's explosive, but we'll need iron before fire. Are you certain you want to swing at a monument? Off the record, be careful." He typed back, "Iron en route." At the transfer house, one of those stubborn shops where the owner had outlived 3 formats and 2 marriages, they handed the can to a man who wore a magnifier like jewelry. He popped the seal with reverence. 35 years ago I watched wedding reels all day," he said. "Now I resurrect ghosts for living." He fed the leader, cleaned the gate, set the light. "Give me an hour," he said, "and a story when you're done." They ate sandwiches that shed bread like snow. Owen sat with his back to the wall. Margaret sat where she could see the door. Daniel wrote names in his notebook until the paper looked like a memorial trying to memorize itself. When the transfer finished, the man handed them a drive and a pair of white cotton gloves folded like a blessing. "You didn't get this from me," he said, "but if anyone asks, tell them I hope the dead finally collect." They stepped into afternoon that had solved its argument with light. On the drive back, a black SUV fell in behind them, then beside them, then back again, as if practicing choreography. Daniel kept his eyes ahead. The SUV took an exit without signaling. They didn't exhale until the next town. Margaret spoke, almost amused. "Do important people always borrow that color car?" "Important people don't need cars," Owen said. "They travel inside other people's choices." Daniel's phone chimed again. The courtesy letter promised earlier, now real, full of adjectives that pretended to be laws. He read it, then closed it. "Teeth," he said. Owen asked, "Bite?" "Soon," Daniel said. "We'll feed them metal first." Evening gathered in the lavender fields, a patient tide. Back at the farmhouse they tested the transferred file. The images breathed on the screen with new clarity. The drums, the gold, the gesture, the face that had practiced clean angles since youth. Daniel sent 2 copies, one to a lawyer friend who believed in paper, one to the network with a note that didn't beg. Then he stepped outside. The wind had begun to rise, that pre-storm rearrangement of the world. From somewhere far off, thunder negotiated with horizon. Inside, Margaret and Owen stood near the table, 2 figures learning again how to be in the same frame. She touched the film can, then took her hand away, then put it back as if deciding whether to keep history on a leash or let it run. Daniel looked up at the weather and said to no one, "It's coming." Storms introduce themselves days in advance, in small negotiations, pressure dropping like a whispered warning, the lavender leaning 1 degree farther than comfort, the spoon chime learning a new language. By Friday the sky wore that steel sheen that says choose your shelter now. Daniel cued the film on his laptop and watched the first 5 seconds again. Drums, numbers, a pry bar, the light catching what light always loves. Then the face, Harlan. Younger, precise, the mouth that had practiced command since childhood. He paused on that frame and let time divide itself, the boy inside the general inside the boy. He sent the clip to the network, the short version first, the one that kept its blade clean. Then he sent the long one to a lawyer who still believed in sentences that end with periods instead of prices. He copied both to a drive he wore on a cord under his shirt, like a borrowed heart. Owen watched from the doorway. "You're sure?" he asked. "No," Daniel said, "but I'm finished being unsure." He closed the computer with a soft click that felt like the sound a confession makes when it decides to breathe. The news hit the internet like a dropped wrench. At first, a ping in small places, blogs that survive because stubbornness does, then a low thunder as larger outlets pretended not to notice while refreshing every 90 seconds. Within an hour the clip had been mirrored, translated, decontextualized, defended, attacked, praised for bravery, condemned for treason, and slowed down by a teenager who circled Harlan's hand with a neon arrow and wrote, "Look." Phones began to ring. The lawyer called to say, "Hold your ground." The network called to ask, "Can he go on air tonight?" Daniel looked at Owen. The man's eyes were clear in the way of someone who has decided to trade a secret for air. "Not a studio," Owen said. "Not a stage they built." "Remote," Daniel told the producer. "His terms or nothing." 10 minutes later, agreement and a car in an hour. Another 10, a statement from a foundation with a seal no one had voted for. General Harlan has dedicated his life to the nation. These manipulated images, presented without context, are a grave disservice to those who served with honor. We urge the public to reject smear campaigns that erode our shared legacy. Margaret read it twice. "Legacy," she said, as if testing whether the word had any bone inside. Owen said nothing. He took the tin from his pocket and set it on the table, and did not touch it again. By late afternoon, the car arrived. Dark paint, an antenna like a short apology. The driver looked everywhere except at their faces. In the back seat, Owen sat with his shoulders not quite touching the vinyl, a man making himself into a smaller target out of respect for the car's upholstery. Margaret sat beside him, a shawl around her shoulders that smelled of lavender and weather. Daniel rode up front and watched the road do its usual arithmetic. He asked the driver, "You ever think about how highways are just long? Yes, answers to questions we should have asked twice?" The driver said. "I just make the turns they put on my phone." The studio was a box in a business park. Glass, lights, a lobby plant trying to remember which jungle birthed it. A producer with eyes like a tight schedule met them and rehearsed the rules of politeness. No profanity. No names they couldn't spell. No statements the legal department hadn't domesticated. Owen said, "I speak the dead in their order." The producer blinked and pretended that was in the memo. They walked past a green room where a former politician practiced looking spontaneous. In Studio B, a camera waited on a tripod like a polite gun. The tech adjusted the mic on Owen's collar. His fingers paused at the tremor in Owen's left hand. He pretended not to feel it. Margaret stood just outside frame, the place where history often puts women. Daniel took a position behind the camera where he could nod if the world wobbled. The countdown scrolled in red. Owen inhaled once, the way a swimmer does when the lake is still cold. The host came in through a satellite window, hair immaculate, concern calibrated. Tonight, allegations have surfaced against a decorated war hero. With us, a former radio operator claiming to be the sole survivor of a unit long considered missing. Mr. Keller, if that is your name, what do you want the public to understand? Owen looked into the glass eye and spoke as if addressing a church with no roof. Names keep the dead where we left them. Mine is Owen Keller. 13 men went into a valley near the Laos border in 1970. 12 were found in drums. The 13th built a life out of silence, so the others might one day have sentences. Captain Raymond Harlan ordered the killing of his own. He did it to keep gold that wasn't his, and a story that served him. The host cleared his throat with professional empathy. Those are serious claims. Do you have any proof beyond your memory? Owen didn't look at Daniel. He looked at Margaret, and in that look the correct century returned. You do, he said, meaning we. A film. Not enough frames to give the dead back their breath, but enough to see a hand do what a mouth later denied. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to replace the word missing with murdered on a government line. The host tried a new angle. Why come forward now? Why not decades ago? Owen said, because his shadow was still taller than my wife. On screen, the host's face learned a new shape. It tried to be human and found the margins tight. He pivoted to the general. Joining us by phone, General Harlan's representative. A voice appeared, smooth, expensive, the audio equivalent of a handshake that hides its squeeze. This is shameful. Selective edits, emotional manipulation, a vendetta against a man who cannot go a week without being thanked for his service. We will pursue every legal remedy. Margaret leaned closer to the monitor and said, not into a microphone, but into history, pursue this, and reached for Owen's hand. The host wrapped up with a smile like a lid. The camera's red dot went gray. The studio exhaled. The producer stepped in. That was something, he said, as if congratulating a storm for being wet. We'll follow with the film in the next hour. Legal is conversing with itself. Make it quick, Daniel said. Shadows nap fast. Outside, the air had found its decision, rain. They walked to the car under a sky rehearsing its apology. In the lot, a man in a suit waited near a different dark car and pretended to check his phone. As they passed, he said to no one, Be careful walking in wet places. People fall. People push, Daniel said without stopping. The driver took them home on a route that wasn't a route. Owen watched the mirror. Margaret watched the end of her shawl where 2 threads had come loose and learned to braid themselves. On the highway, a billboard flashed a smiling general saluting flags that didn't know how to object. Margaret said, They made him into weather. Owen answered, Weather still gets measured. They arrived at the farmhouse to find a letter tucked under the mat. Thick paper, embossed crest, the stationery of men who believe in paper. Daniel opened it with his thumb. Cease and desist. Retraction demanded. Failure to comply will result in immediate action. He read it twice, then folded it small and put it in his pocket where small, hard things belonged. Inside the house, the power flickered once, then held. They made coffee because coffee is a way to tell the heart that fire can be contained. Daniel sat at the table and laid out the pieces. The false letter, the real film, the tape whose last words refused to dissolve, the lawyer's number, the drive against his chest like a secret with a pulse. He said, "We need one more nail." Owen looked at him. "Which wall?" "The one behind his public face," Daniel said. "An old friend who thinks silence is patriotic." The phone rang, Reddick's voice, gravel softened by distance. "I saw it," he said. "I thought I was finished talking about that rain." "I was wrong. Campbell didn't laugh the way you said. He laughed once more when the first grenade landed. He said, 'So that's the plan.'" A breath. "I'll testify." Daniel closed his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "You owe me a beer," Reddick replied, "and the dead owe me a better night." He hung up and found Margaret watching him with a patience learned the hard way. "Is this how it ends?" she asked. "No," Daniel said. "Endings are announced. This one will arrive quietly and sit down." Owen stood, the tin in his palm again. He turned it over like a coin, deciding which face to show. He said, "Tomorrow we go to the courthouse. I say it under oath. I want the lie to hear me from where it lives." Thunder spoke from the hills, closer now. The spoon chime answered in its small metal language. The house felt like a chest between breaths. Daniel whispered, to the rain or to himself, "Then tomorrow." The morning after the broadcast, the world spoke in headlines. Some screamed, others whispered. "Hero or butcher? Ghost platoon? Mystery deepens. General Harlan denies allegations, cites political smear." Daniel woke to the soft glow of 100 notifications and the harder truth that not one of them contained peace. He sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the drive against his chest like a second heart beating out of rhythm. Outside, the lavender bent under rain it had not asked for. Margaret was already in the kitchen. Her movements had become deliberate, each gesture a quiet defiance of the chaos outside. Owen stood near the doorway, half in shadow, hands wrapped around a mug that had forgotten how to warm. The radio hummed low. A voice read the morning bulletin. Sources close to the Pentagon confirm an internal review into General Raymond Harlan's wartime record. The White House has postponed his Medal of Freedom ceremony pending clarification of new evidence. Then static. Then silence. Margaret exhaled, not relief, but the long, flat breath of someone who has waited too long to feel anything clean. Owen said nothing. He only turned the mug in his hands, watching the swirl of steam collapse into itself. By noon the journalists came. They arrived not like vultures, but like insects, many wings, small eyes, uninvited. They left microphones at the gate, emails in inboxes, messages wrapped in courtesy. Daniel ignored them all. He knew the news cycle better than anyone in that house. He knew it didn't care for endings, only the noise between them. He spent the day pacing between the front room and the porch, laptop in hand, waiting for the second wave, the denial, the counter-denial, the sanctioned outrage. It came at sunset, as scheduled. A new statement from the Harlan Foundation. General Harlan has been hospitalized following stress-related complications. He remains steadfast in his faith in the American public to distinguish truth from sensationalism. His family asks for privacy during this difficult time. Daniel read it twice. He didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in orchestration. That night, the storm finally came. Wind clawed at the house. Thunder rolled like someone dragging iron down the spine of the valley. The power flickered, then held. Owen sat by the radio, tuning through the static as if searching for a frequency that could take him back before all of this. He found one, an AM band too old to belong to this century. Through the noise, a voice emerged, faint, clipped, formal. Harlan's voice. "To those who have chosen to question my service, I have only this to say. I have lived long enough to see honor turned into accusation. I will not live to see cowardice dressed as truth." Then a pause. A breath. "May God forgive the weak. I never could." Static swallowed the rest. Owen turned the dial slowly until silence returned. His reflection in the window looked like a man caught between decades. Margaret's hand touched his shoulder, her voice barely above the storm. "It's him?" "Yes." "He's breaking." "Or rehearsing it," Owen said. By dawn the news was everywhere. General Harlan found dead in his home. No details, no witnesses, just the soft bureaucratic phrasing that always follows powerful deaths. Authorities do not suspect foul play. Daniel read the words and felt neither triumph nor sorrow, only the strange emptiness that follows when the story takes itself away from you. He closed the laptop. The room felt larger now, like something had been removed from its air. Rainlight touched the table where the tin still lay, a small relic that had outlived its curse. Margaret came in quietly. She didn't ask if he'd heard. She just said, "It's over, isn't it?" Daniel looked up. Over is the word people use when they want silence to mean peace. She sat across from him. Outside, the lavender bowed to the morning wind. "I thought I'd feel clean," she said. "Instead, I feel lighter, but not free." Daniel nodded. Freedom has a terrible sense of timing. Owen. He walked the fields alone that afternoon. Each step sank slightly in the wet earth, as if the ground wanted to keep him. He thought of Harlan, not the general on the news, not the monster in the story, but the man he once called Sir. He used to whistle when he was nervous, Owen remembered. He'd whistle the same tune before every patrol. I can't even remember its name now. He stopped near the fence line. Beyond it, a small creek ran brown with runoff. He crouched, dug into the mud, and felt something cold. A coin. Flattened, colorless, worn smooth by years of forgetting. He rubbed it clean against his sleeve until the faint impression of an eagle appeared. He smiled once, softly. The rain began again, light as mercy. He let the coin fall back into the mud. Back at the house, Daniel set up the recorder for one last interview. Not for television this time, for history. Owen sat beside Margaret. No microphones, just air and the sound of the storm's tail end brushing against the windows. Daniel spoke first. "You don't have to say anything more." Owen answered, "That's why I will." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice quiet enough to make the walls lean closer. "I thought killing a man like Harlan would make a sound. It didn't. The world kept moving, just quieter. I keep wondering if silence is justice or just the part we can't record." Margaret took his hand, her thumb drawing small circles over his scarred knuckles. "You did what you had to," she said. "No," he replied. "I did what I couldn't any more avoid." That evening the three of them sat outside as the clouds opened into slow gold. The world smelled of wet earth and lavender crushed underfoot. No one mentioned Harlan again. He had already begun his final transformation, from man to headline to absence. Margaret said, "You think people will remember?" Daniel replied, "They'll remember the film, not the faces." She smiled faintly. "Then we should make peace with being background noise." Owen added, "Noise is better than silence if it's honest." Daniel looked toward the hills where the light sank behind the trees. For a moment he imagined 12 shadows walking there, slow, patient, not angry. The men of Bravo, returning to the story that had forgotten their names. Later, when the house had settled and the world had cooled, Daniel sat alone at the table and wrote the final line of his article. "The dead are not missing. They are waiting for us to remember correctly." He read it once, then twice, then turned off the lamp. From the porch he could hear Owen and Margaret talking softly, voices too low for meaning but high enough for life. Their silhouettes moved in rhythm, two small figures against the broad quiet. Daniel closed his notebook, feeling the strange ache of completion. Outside the spoon chime sang again, gentler now, as if the wind had learned humility. He whispered to himself, "Maybe that's what justice sounds like." The week after Harlan's obituary learned to fold itself into the lower corners of the news, the weather remembered how to be ordinary. Rain thinned, clouds learned their edges again. On the farmhouse porch, the spoon chime spoke less and listened more. Daniel printed the article twice, one for paper, one for pen. He liked the way ink made a promise it had to keep. The headline had argued with him for days. It finally settled on a sentence that did not raise its voice. Hill 47. A correction. He left the second copy on the kitchen table beside the tin. Margaret read in silence, lips moving without sound, like a person learning a prayer she didn't trust yet. Owen did not read. He watched her read and let that be enough. "Will they change the records?" she asked when the house remembered it had air. "They'll try," Daniel said. "Records are proud. They hate to be wrong in public." "Then maybe do it in private," she answered, a tired smile unbuttoning her mouth for a moment. On the counter a small radio breathed. It had been repaired so many times it was more persistence than parts. Owen tuned the dial until the static settled on a station that cared only about other people's weather. The phone calls changed their shape. Before Harlan's death, they had arrived as teeth: cease, desist, retract, regret. After, they came as cotton: condolences, thoughts and prayers, an institutional voice learning contrition without pronunciation. A Pentagon liaison called to say there would be a review. A state senator called to ask about healing. A veterans group emailed to request permission to use Owen's name, as if names had owners. Daniel answered politely and briefly, and always with the same sentence at the end: "Spell the dead correctly." In the second week, an envelope arrived from an office that had never before known their address. Inside, a printed notice, a formal signature, and a correction whose taste was both metal and rain. Bravo Co. 2/7 Cav. Status update Keller, O&A. Status amended from MIA, presumed dead, to survived, primary witness. Campbell, Ortiz, 12 names. Status amended from MIA, presumed dead, to KIA, homicide. Margaret traced each name with one finger. "Why do corrections always feel like eulogies written by clerks?" she asked softly. Daniel said, "Because the living are bad at speaking to the exact dead." Owen took the paper last. He did not read aloud. He folded the page once, then again, until the crease looked like a road half built, and slid it into the tin as if returning a borrowed truth. There is a kind of peace that arrives as work. They learned that in the months that followed. Margaret replanted the lavender beds, kneeling slowly, palms in soil that remembered everything and judged nothing. She labeled each row with a small wooden stake, not with Latin, but with months: April, May, June, so the year could find itself in scent. Owen fixed radios for men who told him their wars the way people confess to rivers, without expectation, only because movement invites sound. Sometimes he soldered a wire and the room filled with a station playing songs that sounded like maps. Sometimes the stations were empty and he liked it that way: silence printed by a machine. At night they ate the kind of meals that understand they do not have to impress anyone: stews, bread, tea, a slice of apple beneath a stripe of cinnamon for courage. They did not say grace. They let the steam do it. Daniel visited when the road remembered him. He stayed in the spare room that had learned his weight, wrote drafts in the morning, walked to the creek in the afternoon, and in the evening read lines aloud, not to be praised but to be corrected by the weather. Owen listened for the places where the air flinched. Margaret listened for where the sentences landed and whether the house kept breathing after. Sometimes, as dusk arrived like a careful guest, they talked about nothing dangerous: recipes, a neighbor's dog, the way thunder has different dialects depending on the month. Sometimes Owen would stop mid-sentence and look toward the field as if someone had called his name very politely from a long way off. Margaret would wait with him until the call passed. In late summer, a letter came from Vietnam: thick paper, blue airmail mark, handwriting that tilted forward like a person carrying an armful of light. Inside, a note from Dr. Nguyen Thanh Nhan, the forensic specialist, and a photograph. The note read, "The site has been consecrated. 12 markers set where the drums were found. When the rains are kind, school children come with paper lanterns. We have left the 13th space empty until you decide what to write there." The photograph showed a hillside that had learned humility: 12 white markers in a hesitant arc. Between them, space, the most honest monument. Daniel held the picture by its corners so his fingerprints wouldn't edit it. "Go," he said. "Who?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. "Both of you," he answered. "I'll carry the part of the story that can't fly." Owen looked at the photograph a long time. He had spent half a century not returning anywhere. Perhaps it was time to visit the one place that had never stopped counting him. The flight was longer than their lifetimes and shorter than their grief. Air held them between geographies and gave them no advice. Out the window, the Pacific lay like a sheet used to cover a body, clean, vast, certain. They arrived during the season when rain has learned patience. The heat touched but did not insist. At the dig site, now a memorial with benches that preferred silence, Doctor, and met them with a bow and a smile that did not trespass. She led them to the markers. Each bore a name. Each name had been taught how to stay. Owen traced Campbell with the back of his fingers. He spoke one sentence to each stone, not a prayer, not a report, just a piece of weather only that marker could understand. At the empty space, Doctor, and placed a small wooden plank on 2 bricks, the way a carpenter might pause a project to let it learn its future. "What will we write?" she asked. Margaret looked at Owen. Owen looked at the hillside, then the sky, then the small river that had once been cruel and was now simply itself. He said, "Not my name. Names hold men. I want a sentence that holds all of this." Daniel took out the folded article, the one he had kept clean and uncreased, and read the last line again. "The dead are not missing. They are waiting for us to remember correctly." Margaret nodded. "Write that," she said, "in both languages." Dr. Ann smiled, the smile of someone who knows how to spell tenderness twice. She sketched the sentence in Vietnamese first, then in English, chalk whispering against the plank like a modest tide. When it was done, they stood back. The empty place was not empty anymore. It had a job now. As evening came on, children from the village arrived, hands full of lanterns, paper thin, and colors that had learned humility. One by one they set lights on the water. 1,000 small suns began their slow drift along the creek, down toward the bend where the stream widened and human engineering had once pretended to be fate. Owen stood with his palms open. Margaret threaded her fingers through his, and he did not move to hide the tremor. Some shaking is simply the body remembering the measurement of history. Daniel watched their silhouettes against the lanterns and thought of frames, how some frames are prisons and others are forgiveness. They stayed 3 days. They ate noodles that tasted like weather and fish that had never learned the word yesterday. They listened to elders speak with pauses long enough for the air to contribute. They walked the slope in the morning when mist edits distance, and in the evening when colors admit that they are tired. On the last morning before the car took them back toward airports and lines and the polite tyrannies of return, Owen knelt by the marker that bore Ortiz and left the coin the rain had once returned to him. He pressed it into the soil until it felt held. He said nothing. The coin spoke perfectly fine on its own. Dr. An gave them a small parcel wrapped in brown paper, a piece of the oilcloth that had wrapped the note, a photograph of the 12 markers, a pressed leaf from the hillside. "For your house," she said. "For the house that taught itself to be one," Margaret answered. Home again, the seasons turned without ceremony. Autumn softened the edges of the fields. Winter spoke briefly in the throat of the air and then reconsidered. On a night when frost wrote its brief diary on the window and the stove, learned a new patience, Daniel returned with one last thing to set down. He placed a modest plank on the mantel. Margaret dusted it with the corner of her shawl. Owen stepped close, reading the burned-in words, the same sentence as the hillside, in both languages. He exhaled in a way that felt like the body recognizing the room it was built for. They did not celebrate. They let the house accept the addition. Later, when the stars learned how to hold still and the radio found a frequency that sounded exactly like distance being kind, the 3 of them sat on the porch with mugs that no longer shook as much. Daniel said, "I'm going back once more. Hill 47. I'll file the final piece from there." Margaret squeezed Owen's hand. "Bring a photograph," she said, "not for the paper." "For this room," Daniel nodded. "I'll bring the weather instead." They laughed, small and correctly. Epilogue: 2 still figures in one quiet frame. It was late spring in Vietnam when Daniel stood again at the crest of the memorial and let the river talk first. He set down a small wooden stake he had carried in his bag across hemispheres. He pressed it into the soil between the 12th marker and the plank that bore the sentence. On the stake, in block letters, he'd burned a simple name: Owen Keller, the one who remembered. He stepped back. The words did not need him. They knew how to stand. A light breeze stitched itself through the grass. Daniel turned on a small handheld recorder, a habit, a superstition, a way to make sure silence understood it had an audience. He spoke, not to publication, not to a court, but to the weather. "You were never missing," he said. "We were." He clicked the machine off. The river kept the rest. That evening he wrote the final paragraph of the piece that would not run on a front page but would live in the places that make front pages possible. In the end, the world did not tilt. Traffic kept its promises. The rain performed its work. A man died rather than learn the shape of his face, and another lived long enough to let his name return to his own mouth. Two people sat beside each other and did not need to speak. Perhaps that is justice, not the noise of punishment, but the quiet of a room that finally knows who it is for. He sealed the notebook, a ritual that felt like closing a door without locking it. Montana again, the lake the color of a mirror that had learned humility. Late afternoon wore its copper coat. On the porch, Owen and Margaret sat in chairs that had long ago memorized their weight. Between them, a small radio with a cracked dial hummed a line of static, then found a station that did not insist. No one spoke. Sometimes love is simply the promise not to add sound. After a time, an old frequency slipped through, as if a wire under the earth had remembered its job. The voice came soft, eroded by distance, shaped by ghosts. "Bravo Company. This is Hill 47. Do you copy?" "Over." They did not answer. They let the question sit on the railing and look at the lake. Owen reached across the arm of his chair and found Margaret's hand. He did not grip. He did not prove. He simply held, a verb that understands itself. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He felt the small weight of it, the precise arithmetic of a life returning to balance. In the yard, the lavender accepted the wind and refused to break. Inside, on the mantel, the plank carried its two alphabets as if no translation were necessary. The tin sat open beside it, empty now, or rather filled with the one thing it had never been offered before: air. Daniel's last sentence floats somewhere between the house and the hill, between the old rain and the new. After half a century, they did not recover time. They recovered truth, and sometimes only that is enough to call return. The evening took their outlines gently, like a teacher collecting papers that will not be graded. The radio went quiet, not off, two different arts. The wind passed through the spoon chime. It made no song. It needed none. Fade to listening.